Hi, and welcome to episode 105 of Toke Signals TV, where we bring you the biggest in cannabis and hemp news stories every week. I'm Steve Elliott, the editor at tokesignals.com, and I'll be guiding you through the news. First, let's look at our customary Toke Signals bud pick of the week. We have a flower here of Chernobyl, a pretty sativa dominant strain. And you see the little miniature tree there. Looks quite appealing. Let's do the news now, shall we? In the United States, big news this week as Senator Bernie Sanders introduced legislation to end federal marijuana prohibition. Democratic presidential candidate Bernie Sanders announced at a Wednesday town hall meeting that he is introducing legislation in the Senate that would remove marijuana from the list of federally controlled substances, end federal marijuana prohibition, and let states set their own policies without federal interference. This bill, which could be introduced as early as Thursday, is expected to be similar to a 2011 bill introduced in the U.S. House by Democrat Barney Frank and Republican Ron Paul, known then as the Ending Federal Marijuana Prohibition Act. It would be the first bill ever introduced in the U.S. Senate to end the failed war on marijuana. Clearly, Bernie Sanders has looked at the polls showing voter support for marijuana legalization, said Michael Collins, Deputy Director of National Affairs for the Drug Policy Action, the political arm of the Drug Policy Alliance, the DPA. Marijuana reform was already moving forward in Congress, but we expect this bill to give reform efforts a big boost, Collins said. Earlier this year, sweeping legislation known as the CARES Act was introduced by Senators Rand Paul, Cory Booker, and Kristen Gillibrand that would legalize marijuana for medical use. Several spending amendments allowing states to set their own marijuana policies without federal interference have already passed the U.S. House and/or the Senate Appropriations Committee this year. Senate Republicans included several marijuana reforms in their recent minibus spending package, including prohibiting the DEA from undermining state medical marijuana laws, requiring the Veterans Administration to allow veterans to use medical marijuana, and prohibiting the Treasury Department from blocking banks from providing checking accounts to state-legalized marijuana dispensaries. According to a new Gallup poll, a majority of Americans continue to say marijuana use should be legal in the United States, with 58% in support, tying the high point in Gallup's 46 years of polling on the subject. These results are consistent with other state and national polls, both public and private, in recent months. Polls have consistently shown public support for medical marijuana ranging from 70 to 90% over the past 2 decades. As more states legalize marijuana for medical or non-medical use, the pressure to change federal law will continue to grow, said Bill Piper, Director of National Affairs at the Drug Policy Action. There is a clear bipartisan majority in Congress for letting states set their own marijuana policies, Piper said. The National Cannabis Industry Association this week applauded Bernie Sanders' legalization move. The NCIA on Thursday applauded new legislation to be introduced by Senator Sanders, which of course would remove marijuana from the Controlled Substances Act and allow it to be regulated similarly to alcohol. That approach would allow states that choose a legal, regulated approach to marijuana to move forward without federal interference, and allow banking access and fair taxation to state-compliant cannabis businesses. Mr. President, too many Americans in this country have seen their lives destroyed because they have criminal records as a result of marijuana use, Sanders said on the Senate floor on Thursday. That's wrong. That has got to change. The time is long overdue for us to take marijuana off of the federal government's list of outlawed drugs, Senator Sanders said. More than half of Americans now live in states where marijuana is legal in some form, and more than half of Americans now say marijuana should be fully legal, said NCIA Executive Director Aaron Smith. Federal law should respect these states, these voters, and the responsible cannabis businesses they support. Senator Sanders' bill would also give state legal cannabis businesses the fairness they deserve, treating them like any other law-abiding, job-creating, tax-paying small business, according to Smith. Our industry applauds Senator Sanders for his leadership in moving our nation toward a more rational approach to marijuana, consistent with what the American people want. Senator Sanders' legislation would remove marijuana from the Controlled Substances Act and allow states to set and enforce their own marijuana policies without federal interference. This would not only give each state the freedom to choose its own approach, but also would remove the many unintended consequences of the current conflict between state and federal cannabis laws. The most critical of these are the lack of banking access for cannabis businesses and the outdated 280E tax code provision, which forces legal marijuana businesses to pay effective federal tax rates of 50 to 85%, a crippling burden for businesses doing their best to play by the rules. Also in the U.S. this week, as the presidential campaign heats up, the GOP candidates are out of touch on marijuana legalization. This week's Republican presidential debate in Colorado showed that the GOP candidates are out of touch with the majority of American voters when it comes to legalization, according to a leading financial advisor. Once again, the Republicans don't take the opportunity to speak to an overwhelming percentage of Americans in regards to state rights and legalization of marijuana, said David Denenberg, CEO and founder of Kind Financial, a financial services firm for the legal cannabis industry. The party should realize that several red states have some form of legalization on the 2016 ballots, and the voters and consider the candidate's position on marijuana, Denenberg said. He's made it no secret that he thinks the public debate should mirror the increasing intensity of the conversation, with more than 63% of Americans believing marijuana should be legal, according to Denenberg. David would know, as he's well versed in the political and financial angles of cannabis legalization issues. Last night's debate in Colorado revealed quite a bit about who is grounded in facts with a plan for the U.S. economy and who is just in it for a political dance, Denenberg said. How far cannabis has come in this country and how sophomoric the candidates can be. The CNBC debate was hosted in Colorado, where the return on investment of cannabis has markedly increased the state's economy. And the improvement, according to Denenberg, rests squarely on the foundation of the legal marijuana business. But there was very little addressing the topic and more sideways comments about gateway drugs and juvenile pot jokes, according to Denenberg. Cannabis is the fastest growing industry in the United States, he said, and he said he'd welcome a debate where each candidate would seriously answer the following three questions. What is each candidate's position on the topic of marijuana legalization? Will the Republican nominee respect the states? And will they reschedule or deschedule cannabis? In the first Republican debate, there was a mixed bag of positions, including the drama of who had smoked pot, and opposition to weed as a supposed gateway drug, disproved by science, of course, as well as mention of the failure of the war on drugs. This week's debate was no better, even with moderator Carl Quintanilla's astute question about whether Colorado could be a model for the other states, like Ohio, according to Denenberg. With up to 16 states with marijuana legalization referendums, this will be on voters' minds as they also vote for president, Denenberg said. Will marijuana decide the presidential election? It might, Denenberg added. I can't think of another multi-billion-dollar industry that's completely domestic, he said. The product is grown, made, and sold 100% within the United States. You would think the GOP would take a long, slow toke on that. In Canada, Trudeau prepares to legalize cannabis. As Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau prepares to legalize marijuana as part of his Liberal government's legislative agenda, experts say he'll be able to access a world-class cannabis framework set up under the previous Conservative government. A renowned production and distribution system has already been established under Canada's medical marijuana system, according to Chuck Raffici, who co-founded the nation's first publicly traded cannabis manufacturer. Raffici, also a volunteer chief financial officer for the Liberal Party's National Board of Directors, credits Stephen Harper's Conservative government for the country's marijuana infrastructure. I'm sure it's not something he would like to have on his resume, but I think only a Conservative government could have created the MMPR, the Marijuana for Medical Purposes Regulations, according to Raffici. I think if another government had been in power, the Conservative base would have been up in arms, he said. Obviously, the courts have forced them along the way, he said, but they've put in a very robust system. The Conservative government in 2013 announced Health Canada would no longer grow marijuana for patients, a decision that created a commercial industry for medicinal cannabis. Trudeau's Liberal Party has promised to legalize and regulate the use and sale of marijuana for recreational purposes. Canada's current system of marijuana prohibition does not work, the Liberal election platform said. We will remove marijuana consumption and incidental possession from the criminal code and create new, stronger laws to punish more severely those who provide it to minors, those who operate a motor vehicle while under its influence, and those who sell it outside of the new regulatory framework. The first step will be to establish a provincial, territorial, and federal task force to hear from public health, substance abuse, and public safety experts. Canada is well positioned to do this, according to Donald McPherson, director of the Canadian Drug Policy Commission. McPherson said he'd like to see the Liberals move forward on legalization early, though that doesn't mean rushing it, he said. He added it's important to fund monitoring and evaluating the system once it's up and running. I think it is a landmark change for Canada, and I think they're on the cutting edge of what will be essentially an international movement, said Brian Vicente, a Colorado-based lawyer involved in the United States campaign to bring marijuana into a regulated market system. In Croatia this week, marijuana was legalized for medical use, but with tight restrictions. Croatia has legalized the sale and use of marijuana for medical use following a campaign sparked by the arrest of a multiple sclerosis patient who grew the plant to ease his pain. Medicines containing tetrahydrocannabinol, THC, the principal psychoactive ingredient in cannabis, can now be prescribed by doctors to ease health problems associated with cancer, MS, epilepsy, and AIDS. The limits, unfortunately, are absurdly low. Cannabis products can only be prescribed for up to 30 days, while the overall quantity for the month can exceed a paltry 7.5 grams, according to the new regulations. Any other use of marijuana remains illegal under Croatian law. The issue came to public attention in Croatia, a member state of the European Union, last year after Juanito Luksidic, an MS patient, was detained for growing his own cannabis in his garden near Rijeka, a northern city on the Adriatic coast. Luksidic, 37, said the plants were for his personal use to make cannabis oil, which helps ease his symptoms. Police seized 20 kilos, about 44 pounds of marijuana. For us, patients, cannabis is one of the most important plants for our lives and health, Luksidic said. Everyone should have the right to choice and self-cure. Sadly, under the new rules, patients still won't be allowed to grow their own medicine. When his case came to light, several patient and doctor associations spoke out about the use of cannabis oil and other marijuana-derived products in helping to treat certain diseases. The health ministry earlier this year set up a commission to study the issue, upon whose recommendations and a public debate the regulations were written. Cannabis oil has been available until now on the Croatian black market for anything between 300 to 600 euros for 10 grams. That's $343 to $686 per 10 grams. Medical marijuana will be available in pharmacies within a few weeks, according to Health Minister Sinisa Varga, depending on market interest. According to information that we have from wholesale drugstores, quite a lot of them are interested in importing cannabis-derived products to Croatia, he said. Croatia joins other EU countries such as Spain, Portugal, the Czech Republic, and the Netherlands in allowing some cannabis use. In South Carolina, sad story this week, as marijuana charges were dropped after a cop kills a teen in a parking lot. In a horrific abuse of police power, 19-year-old Zachary Hammond was shot and killed in July in a Hardee's parking lot by an officer after an undercover narc lured 23-year-old Tony Morton, Hammond's date, there to sell marijuana. After Hammond was shot and killed, Morton was charged with possession of 10 grams of marijuana. On Tuesday, 3 months later, local circuit solicitor Chrissy Adams announced she won't be pressing charges after, quote, careful consideration of the facts of the case, a thorough review of the state investigation, and an extensive review of all applicable law. Police claim the officer, Mark Tiller, acted in self-defense, but attorneys for Hammond's family point out that an autopsy they commissioned found Hammond was shot in the back. The dash cam video of the incident released by authorities shows that Tiller fired at Hammond after the car was already driving away. Attorneys also petitioned the South Carolina Attorney General to remove Adams from the case since it involved a cop within her circuit and because of other conflicts of interests. Adams refused to recuse herself, while the Attorney General hasn't responded to the petition. The U.S. Department of Justice is also investigating the incident to determine whether to bring federal charges. The U.S. attorney investigating asked her not to release any more information about the shooting, Adams claimed. The family is suing both the Seneca Police Department and Officer Tiller himself. In Ohio this week, a poll showed support for marijuana legalization, but not so much for Issue 3. This new public opinion poll shows that nearly half of Northeast Ohio residents have tried marijuana, and most of them support some form of legalization. But they aren't so sure about Issue 3. Medical marijuana receives overwhelming support at 83%, according to the Baldwin-Wallace University Community Research Institute poll released on Monday. A smaller majority of 55% favor legalizing possession of marijuana for personal use, but just 43% of respondents said they were likely or very likely to vote for Issue 3. That's the marijuana legalization measure on the November 3rd ballot in Ohio. About 38% said they'd likely not vote for Issue 3, and almost 20% were still undecided. That lukewarm level of support may reflect the complexity of the ballot issue, according to Lauren Copeland, Associate Director of the Community Research Institute and political science professor. Issue 3, sponsored by a group called Responsible Ohio, would legalize recreational and medical marijuana for adults 21 and older, but commercial cannabis could only be grown at 10 sites belonging to, you guessed it, the wealthy investors who were bankrolling the initiative. Ohio adults could grow up to 4 mature marijuana plants in a secure private area at home after obtaining a home grow license. Issue 3 would grant a monopoly for commercial growers, according to its ballot language, a word choice upheld by the Ohio Supreme Court. While there is clear support for the legalization of marijuana for medical use, support for recreational use is more tepid, Copeland said. In addition, many voters have concerns about the potential for Issue 3 to create a monopoly for growers. Before we go this week, let me direct your attention to a must-read on TokeSignals.com. It's an article by activist Miggy420, and he has come out and revealed his real identity in this article and revealed the reasons why. It's an inspiring piece of work, a beautiful piece of writing, and basically a story of how cannabis came into his life and stayed, and what made him decide to fight for the right of people to access this plant. Anonymous marijuana activist comes out of the closet on TokeSignals.com. You really should check it out. Until next week, stay lifted. See you then.